Hello, and welcome to Overheard, the Foreign Policy Research Institute monthly podcast that explores the national security implications of intelligence activities, irregular warfare, and political warfare. My name is Phil Wasielewski, and I am the director of FPRI's Center for the Study of Intelligence and Non-Traditional Warfare. Joining our podcast today are two retired senior intelligence officials. First, we have Mr. John McLaughlin, a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, who served as the acting director of Central Intelligence from July to September 2004, and was the deputy director of Central Intelligence from June of 2000 till November of 2004. Also joining us is Ms. Sue Gordon, a 25-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency, who also served as the deputy director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency from January 2015 to August 2017, and as Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence from August 2017 to August 2019. This edition of Overheard is going to discuss Title I of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 that created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI. We will discuss how the intelligence community had been led before that act, what lessons have been learned regarding managing the intelligence community in the 20 years since that legislation, and if the present law governing the ODNI is optimal, or if, in the opinion of our guest, there could be changes for the better. Our two guests are well positioned to discuss this issue, having served in some of the senior-most positions of the intelligence community. Before we begin, let's provide you, our listeners, with a little background about coordinating the various agencies that make up the U.S. intelligence community. As we mentioned in our last podcast about the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first to try to coordinate the activities of the country's information gathering assets, which at the time consisted of Army and Navy intelligence, the State Department, and the FBI. In July 1941, he created the Office of the Coordinator of Information, COI, and appointed William Wild Bill Donovan as its chief to overcome the lack of coordination regarding intelligence gathering and analysis within the U.S. government. The orders creating COI were vague. Its duties crossed the boundary lines of other agencies, and for the most part, the military, FBI, and State Department ignored Donovan. During World War II, there was no centralized direction of the nation's intelligence gathering or analysis. After World War II, President Harry Truman created the position of the Director of Central Intelligence, or DCI, on January 23, 1946. Its first occupant, Admiral Sidney Sowers, headed the Central Intelligence Group, a small interim intelligence entity that served as a bridge between the OSS and CIA, and he provided Truman with daily briefings on world events. The National Security Act of 1947 created America's first peacetime and civilian intelligence organization, CIA, and made the DCI, who had formerly been head of CIG, the head of CIA, and the president's primary intelligence advisor on the National Security Council. Now, for the entire Cold War and over a decade afterwards, the DCI was dual-hatted as both the director of the CIA and as the titular head of the intelligence community that grew as the intelligence needs of the Cold War grew. I say titular head because most intelligence agencies belong to the Defense Department, such as the National Security Agency and the Defense Intelligence Agency, just to name a few. It's the Secretary of Defense who appoints their leadership and controls their budgets. It was said that the DCI could coordinate intelligence community work only when the Secretary of Defense allowed him to. However, to be fair, the DCI did have certain tools and authorities, starting with access to the president and overseeing the development of the National Foreign Intelligence Program budget after a decision by then President Carter. The DCI was helped in its community leadership work by a small office known as the Community Management Staff. After the terrorist attacks of 9/11, the 9/11 Commission and others recommended that the position of overseeing and managing the intelligence community be separated from the position running the CIA. In December 2004, President George W. Bush signed the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act that created the position of a Director of National Intelligence and transferred from CIA to DNI, the Community Management Staff, the National Intelligence Council, and the authority to oversee the National Intelligence Program budget. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and FPRI thought that this is an appropriate time to ask, what difference did the intelligence reform legislation make? What lessons have been learned over the past 2 decades in managing the intelligence community? And is the present legislation governing the ODNI optimal? Or, if in the opinion of our guest, could there be changes for the better? So let me turn to our guests. John, Sue, we are so grateful to have you on our podcast today. John, if I could turn to you first as one of the last people to serve as a DCI, please explain to our audiences how the DCI construct worked with regards to community management, and what were the benefits and what were the drawbacks to this type of system?
Thank you, Phil. Well, you touched on the key thing, which is that the Director of Central Intelligence ran the CIA, but also had a large staff attached to the director, the community management staff, that was responsible for keeping track of what was going on in all of the other agencies. And at that time, I'd have to do the math, but I think there were about 15 or 16 agencies. There are currently several more. And those agencies included big, important agencies like the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the Defense Intelligence Agency, and even the National Reconnaissance Office, which was responsible for inventing, building major technical intelligence programs. As you can tell from what I've said, that was a lot. In other words, the drawbacks of the system, let me start first with that, centered mainly on the fact that the DCI, the Director of Central Intelligence, was also running a global agency, the CIA, with missions all around the world to collect and analyze intelligence, to carry out covert operations, and so forth. So that was a handful. And at the same time, had to periodically check in on all of these other agencies to see whether they were meeting mission, whether they had particular needs. We had to make decisions on what kind of satellites would be built. We had to make decisions on restructuring some of these agencies, and so forth. And we had some help from that, from the community management staff. But at the end of the day, the decisions had to be made by the director and deputy director of Central Intelligence. So that was a handful. Now, what were the benefits of the system? The benefits of the system were that things were centralized. You knew who was responsible. You knew who was accountable for things that were undertaken, that worked and that didn't work in the community. And I will say this, that the CIA, and I'm completely respectful and admiring of all of the other agencies, but the CIA is a little special in that it does just about everything. It does collection, it does analysis, it does technical intelligence, it does global support of various kinds, and it's the only agency in the community that is in a chain of command that doesn't make or implement policies. So it has a certain independence that other agencies have to a degree, but not to the same degree. So the advantage of the system was that this organization, the CIA, which brought together so many aspects of the intelligence discipline, could exercise influence and direction over the entire community in a way that we thought was then beneficial. Now, I'm going to stop there except to make one other comment, and maybe we can come back to it. And that is, bear in mind that the creation of the Director of National Intelligence was done in the midst of a presidential campaign. So it was, in large part, I don't know whether I'd say 50%, 60%, but it was in large part a political decision stemming from dissatisfaction with the intelligence that had been involved in the run-up to the Iraq War, and also, to some degree, looking back at 9/11. So there was a strong sense at that time that there needed to be some fundamental change in the intelligence community. And, a lot of us differed with that. I can go into that. But in the end, that was the decision that was made. And then, as usual, everyone got on board and with the aim of let's make this work.
Sue, I have the same question for you, but based on the DNI construct. What are the benefits and drawbacks of the current system for coordinating the intelligence community?
Everything John said about back in the day, I agree with. I thought it was a really balanced view of what came in. And we can talk about what the rationale was behind it and what the people were thinking at the time they formed it. But we'll just say that it was formed, and then I'll pick it up from there. So let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of the ODNI. One, it is, for all the things John said about the strength of the Central Intelligence Agency, and like John, I have a bias because I was there for so long. That's who I was, and I saw its strengths. It did have a particular view. It was the adjudicator of all the other information that came from the other agencies. And I think that one of the strengths of the ODNI was that there was an ability to include other views from other organizations, whether that's NSA or INR or the services or any of the others, in a way that didn't come from any purpose other than coming up with the best view, using the best information in the best way. And that's not that wasn't what the Central Intelligence Agency was doing, but I think this was a new opportunity. So one is that independence. Two, I do believe if I look at the performance of the intelligence community over the years since 9/11, through the advent of very aggressive digital cyber activity by our adversaries and competitors who understood what was available to them as a threat surface, one of the real advantages of the DNI was the inclusion of the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security that had the authorities to act domestically, that became important as we needed to counter that threat. And I think I believe that their inclusion was easier under the construct of the DNI than it might have been under the Central Intelligence Agency or the construct that we had before. So I just think that move into needing to include organizations that had a domestic set of authorities was an advantage. Two, while the ODNI was originally established first from coordinating oversight, second, it moved into integration. When the world changed and you needed to be able to help the community consider whether it needed an aggregate to be different, not just each agency to be different, the fact that the law gave the DNI budget authority became a really interesting opportunity to use that in order to shape the intelligence community, in whether that is pivot to China or other things, just as it had been used to address counterterrorism when it was first started. And I guess I'll close kind of my remarks on the strengths to say, I think one of the great strengths of the intelligence community is that it is in a department. It doesn't have a secretary, and the authorities of the DNI are not secretary-like. So what you have is really a loose confederation of independent agencies and organizations that have a common thrust. And with the DNI, they're allowed to be organized, but you haven't created a brand new hierarchy. And so in a way, the intelligence community because of the independence of the agencies, tends to be a little bit more nimble, a little quicker to respond to change because you're not trying to have everything go through a single head for every operational act. That isn't what the D&I does. It's really trying to take this loose confederation and put it all together. So I think there's some obvious strengths. I think one of the weaknesses is the weakness anytime you add an organization, you really have to counter the idea of adding a layer of bureaucracy, adding convening that doesn't need to be convened, making sure that every action that the OD&I takes is to make the community more effective, to provide them with insight about what the community is doing as a whole so each agency can make a better decision about what they need to do. And this tussle between not being overhead, not overstepping, but still shaping and allowing perspective, I think is one that is always tough to manage. So not becoming overhead. And then the last thing I'll just say is it is really easy to keep adding mission to the OD&I as an easy button. Each new issue, well, let's have the OD&I take that on. Let's talk about counterterrorism as a great example. When the OD&I was formed, the National Counterterrorism Center was formed. The agencies were not doing nearly enough each independently on counterterrorism, so there was good reason to pull it together. If you look at counterterrorism now, each agency is doing much more. Do you need the same size National Counterterrorism Center? So I think the ability of the OD&I to kind of wax and wane, appear when it needs to appear and disappear when it can appear is one of the things that is counter to institutions, but is probably one of the keys to its future success is the ability to do that.
Well, thanks, Sue, for that perspective. I've got a question, and that's how much has really changed with this legislation as we look at it 20 years later? For both of you, in retrospect, what's the difference? Because, as you mentioned, Sue, it's not secretary-like in authorities, the D&I. It's a little bit stronger in some authorities. You mentioned the budget authorities than the DCI had, but D&I still cannot make or determine what the budgets of the different members of the intelligence community be, or make other changes. So, is the D&I stronger or weaker than the DCI, or is it pretty much the same? I'll put that out, and in retrospect, what has really changed? John, what do you think?
First off, let me say that in Sue's remarks a few minutes ago, you heard why she's such a good leader. In other words, it's difficult to be running the community as the D&I must do, and yet have a light enough touch that people work with you cooperatively because you don't have all the power. You have some power, but not all of the power. What's really changed? Well, the first thing that I would say is that the director of the Central Intelligence Agency is now liberated to a degree, I would say, to run a worldwide mission of the CIA. That's a big job. That is a huge job in and of itself. And I've heard from directors who've become directors of CIA after the creation of the D&I, and I've reflected on it myself that has to be a bit of a luxury compared to what we once were doing, which was everything, and also taking responsibility for everything, including things that went wrong. The CIA director was always blamed. That may sound like a bit of whining, but that's actually a resource issue, because when you are dealing with blame and accountability, it takes a lot of effort to fix a problem, whether you've been responsible for it or not. So there's that. The CIA director is free to do his or her job now in a way that was constrained before. What's really changed? Well, let me go back a little bit and say, not many people know In fact, I think the only people who genuinely know this would be former NSA and CIA Director Michael Hayden, General Michael Hayden, General Jim Clapper, former occupant of the position that, of the DNI position, and also geospatial intelligence. But Clapper, Hayden, and myself, at the time this was being debated, argued publicly that those three agencies, CIA, NSA, and the Geospatial Intelligence Agency, ought to actually be subordinate to the DNI. In other words, our argument at the time was, if you're going to create a DNI, create a powerful DNI. Don't create someone who has to figure out how to get power. And that was rejected for a whole bunch of reasons. Congress didn't like the idea. And so I would say that the early days of the DNI office were ones in which the DNI was not sufficiently empowered, and I'm talking about 2004, 2005, 2006, not sufficiently empowered to do all of the things that the legislation mandated the DNI to do. And we did a little study of this a few years ago. The DNI has, it's enormous, the responsibilities that legislation places on the DNI. Over years, with some reform, largely under one of the DNIs, the DNI now has more budgetary power, more tasking power, still not achieving the role of a Secretary of Intelligence, which I don't think anyone wanted. But what has changed is that the DNI has become a more influential office than it was in the early days of that office. And I have to say, at the outset, you can go back and find public congressional testimony from me in which I strongly argued against a DNI, fearing that it would be underpowered and more bureaucracy and more layers and so forth. And I think in the early days, that criticism could be valid. I have to say, I've come around to the position of supporting the office of DNI because of the changes that have been made, and because I've seen that it does create a forum in which the intelligence world is even more removed from the cut and thrust of politics than it was in the period of the DCIs, when we did, I think, arguably maintain our independence, but would more frequently get caught in that political crossfire. So there is now, I think, in the DNI, someone who sits a bit above all of this and can arbitrate more in a more judicious way. The final comment I'd make, and I'd be interested to see if Sue has the same view, is I think the power of the DNI is derived 60, 70, 80% from the nature of the DNI's relationship with the president. In other words, if the president of the United States makes clear that this man or woman is his or her number one intelligence officer, that's what gives real power to the DNI. And I think that's the case currently with Avril Haines, the DNI, and the president, President Biden. And it was certainly the case with some of the previous DNIs. Jim Clapper comes to mind with President Obama. So that's something else that's changed. That was always the case with the Director of Central Intelligence, too, that the relationship with the president determined to some degree how much authority the office held. And I think it's even a little more true now with the DNI, because the DNI is not as legislatively empowered as the Director of Central Intelligence was. So I think a number of things have changed, and mostly for the good.
I'll pick up briefly because I think John it covered waterfront pretty well. I think we've gotten used to a DNI. I think it has more power in the way John described, more recognizable power, and the effect of that is twofold. One, it tends to be a good front door. And sometimes good screen, right? One of the things I found as the principal deputy, and I thought Dan Coates did very well, was to take a lot of the hits speak infrequently but clearly about the role of intelligence, allowing the agencies to do their work a little more separate from the political fray than if it didn't exist. Now, that depends on a DNI that sees their role as being that, not as becoming each of the agencies that they lead. But I think that both front door, public face, a bit of a shield creates the effect. And I know I experienced this when I would go into national security and deputy council and deputies committee meetings, where when the DNI led with the overview picture, the individual agencies had more room to articulate the fidelity that they each brought to an issue, that made for a more robust conversation, because now you weren't expecting the CIA to talk about the whole community. You talked about the community view, and then you could dive into each of the nuance. So I think that has grown over time as we've gotten used to it. And I think it does mean that you have to be thoughtful about the selection of the DNI now, knowing that it has that role. And I probably have some others, but I'll just stop on that one as the biggest difference.
Sue, if I could, your description when you were the principal deputy director of national intelligence, attending deputies meetings, other meetings in the situation room, where as opposed to where the DCI was the primary intelligence advisor, now the DNI is the primary intelligence advisor, although the director of the Central Intelligence Agency is still in those meetings. And that you said it allows the other people around the room who have their own intelligence agencies. Basically, the Secretary of State has INR. Obviously, you have Director of CIA there. The Secretary of Defense has NSA and NGA and all the others. It allows for maybe a more robust conversation and maybe also chances for dissent from the party line. But my question is regarding the National Intelligence Council and its use since the reform. It was kind of my impression when I served on the NSC staff and the Intelligence Programs Directorate that the National Intelligence Council was being used less and less for long-term intelligence analysis and analysis of long-term threats, conduct of national intelligence estimates, and more of day-to-day support to the National Security Council and all the answers to the questions that would arise from the deputies and principals meetings. What was your impression? Is that one of the maybe unintended consequences of the Intelligence Reform Act? Is that the national intelligence community does now more short-term crisis management type analysis as opposed to long-term? I'll leave that up to you. And then, John, you're an analyst by trade also. Get your impression.
Yeah, I'll gently start, and then John, you and I can talk about this, because I think it's a really interesting question. I'd lead with, in 2024 and beyond, the definition of long-term and strategic is really different. So you're just going to see a natural evolution of where the focus of estimative work needs to be and integrated work needs to be. 40 years is just almost a nonsensical time frame today. And so the idea that that the council itself is moving a little bit closer, I think, is an artifact of just how dynamic and changing the world is. Certainly, when you have a stronger DNI and you want community view on tough issues, that is going to put more pressure on the community and consequently the National Intelligence Council and that whole apparatus of integrated intelligence. It's going to put more pressure on them to do more tactically relevant products. And that was something that I know Dan spent a lot of time on, and our directors of mission integration that are really leading that substantive piece to make sure that we had the balance right and that we hadn't just sucked every agency into any issue. But I think it is true that they've moved closer. I think we worked hard to make sure that it wasn't an inappropriate use that would diminish the asset that we had on issues that were too tactical for their consideration. But John?
But if I can just add before John goes into his answer, I wasn't talking about 40 years in the future. I mean, we still get that once a year, about 20-year look into the future document. But I'm talking about 2 to 3 years, and I see fewer and fewer national intelligence estimates that come out. So that's kind of where I was asking the question from. John?
Yeah, but I agree with you. 40 years was a stupid thing for me to say, but I will say there is more uncertainty about nearer term issues, more policies being set, more policy discussions that are nearer term, for which it is viewed that there is relevance in thinking about integrated assessment, whether that's an estimate or whether that is one of our different views of assessment. So I think you're right on the observable. I don't know that it's a misuse. I think it is in part an artifact of time, and in part, you're right, an artifact of having the D&I be the one that's coming out of those meetings and directing what happens next. Okay, now you, John.
Well, it's a tough question. It's complicated. I think I would say when it comes to long-term strategic work, national intelligence estimates, the public we're talking to here today may not really even know what that is. We're talking about papers of, let's say, 20 pages length that look 2 or 3 years into the future as best we can. Bob Gates was very wise about this once. He said that the important part of doing those kinds of papers is not the papers themselves. It's the process of doing them. In other words, his point was that by forcing everyone to think about it, come together, state their views, expose their underlying assumptions, that prepared people to think more judiciously and smartly about the things that were happening every day that you had to comment on. The second point I'd make is that in my experience, policymakers don't read those things very carefully. You can produce a bunch of them, but they're going to read the first or second page of those. They read things that are 1 to 2 pages typically. And also, I've often thought that as someone who did this work for a long period of time, doing the day-to-day gives you a strategic view. In other words, you're not just documenting what's happening in the last 24 hours. In everything that you write of 1-page length, if you're a smart analyst, you are thinking about what does this mean for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 months, next year? What are the precedents that I'm uncovering here that will apply for the long term? And so there's a symbiotic relationship between all of these things that are being produced on a daily basis for immediate policy support by the National Intelligence Council. There's a symbiotic relationship between those things and the ability to think longer term, because thinking longer term also involves having to know the data. What is it we're talking about? It isn't just about opinions, it's about data. And this short-term work uncovers and exposes and moves forward a lot of data. So it's a complicated question. But no, bottom line, yes, the community should be doing more long-term work. And the world is structured in a way right now that makes that very difficult because everything's moving so quickly. Also, I would add when I was running the national estimates process, I created a product called Sense of the Community Memo. Well, the acronym is SOCM. In other words, the idea was to put down on maximum of 2 pages what the entire community thought about something in a longer term way. And we found that you can actually do that. And that has turned out to be one of the more powerful documents that persists in informing national security leaders.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate it. And it's a very interesting point about long-term thinking means knowing the data, and we cannot obviously turn the clock back with the legislation. And I don't know if many people who are arguing to do so. We may hear such arguments if there's another 9/11 type event in our nation's history. But what I'd like to ask is a final question for both of you, based on your experience at the top levels of the intelligence community, is if you could write the next bill that reforms the IC, what do you believe is the optimal way for coordinating and managing the intelligence community. What changes would you like to see in the future? And Sue, I'll let you lead with this.
I'd keep the role of the director of national intelligence would be number one. I think it is proven to be beneficial. In general, I almost never believe that legislation keeps us from doing the things we need to. I like the budget authority. I think it needs to continue to be used, especially as the world gets both bigger and stronger. We can't have every agency looking at the same future and deciding independently what they're going to do to get there, because all of them will decide to do the same thing, and there needs to be some piece there. So I love the budget authority. I think you need to look at the staffing of the ODNI, because when it was started, it was kind of oversight. Now it needs to be strategic leadership, and that's a different skill set and a different mindset. Even though strategic leadership is not control, it is shaping and direction. So I think you'd need to look at that. And if there were a legislative change, it might be on reinforcing the notion that, and this is now what I've learned being on the outside of the government looking in, all the different policies of each of the agencies that are administrative, that our private sector partners have to navigate, whether it's in contracting or when the government shuts down or other things, is really burdensome. So I might add some authority that allows the Director of National Intelligence to do some actual consonants of policies to make it easier to interact with all of the community rather than each one at a time. And then the last is I would be really thoughtful about who you put in that position of leadership, because I think what we have had so successfully, you have the principal deputy that is a career intelligence officer. But even if you put a political appointee or someone who has that relationship with the president, you do need to make sure you have someone that understands what intelligence is and what you need to preserve even as you are serving the nation's mission that changes periodically. So just thinking about how you define that position and giving it standing to do all the things that John said and that I hope that I've reinforced.
Would that also apply to such things like security clearances?
This is where I'll make the same kind of caveat that John did. I am really, really passionate that we need to get our act together on security clearances. So many of the things that we talk about that limit our ability to move swiftly to the future go through the administrative processes we have, and nothing is more important to us than security, and more problematic in terms of how we prosecute that. That kind of reform needs to get going. And whether it is personnel security or device security or physical security, I do think there is still distance to travel in terms of having a more unified process that allows the people that we want to move to be able to move at the speed that the mission demands. So yes, I think that has to include security, but this does not mean I'm a security dilettante. It means that I am adamant that if we can't move at speed, if we can't get the talent we need and they can't be put on the jobs that we have for them, we will become irrelevant, and that will be much worse than anything else I can imagine.
John, the last word is yours.
Well, I certainly agree with Sue on keeping the DNI and on the things that she said about augmenting DNI authorities and flexibility, and particularly the last point about getting people through the security process, the right people, smart people, people appropriate to the mission. 3 cheers for all of that. In looking ahead to what we might do in the future to augment the intelligence mission, I think there are some things loose in the world now that make that unknowable, what we should do. But I'll just mention them because I think they will lead to changes that we cannot yet foresee. Uh, Two things in particular. The first is that the way things are changing these days puts a higher priority on what I would call data fusion. In other words, we already see this happening, for example, in the emergence of data on SIGINT, signals intelligence, and photographic intelligence. In other words, the data that's emerging is most powerful when put together. And so I can see, in other words, you reveal trends and dangers and threats and opportunities by putting everything together. And so this could lead to changes in the structure of the intelligence community over time, I think. The second thing, and this is of course involves artificial intelligence, machine learning, cyber techniques that we didn't have 20 years ago, and the outcome of all of that is unknowable. The second thing I'd mention is the growing, I think maybe the greatest challenge the community has now is the growing importance and availability of open source intelligence. And this could be a whole podcast unto itself, but the main point I would make about it is that, easily available overhead photography, commercially available SIGINT, cinematography that can be contracted. Some of the work that's being done in the open source world now is astonishing and certainly equivalent to what the intelligence community would have done on its own 10 years ago or certainly 20 years ago. And factoring all of that in the right balanced way with classified intelligence that we collect at great cost and coming out with the right balance, I think, is maybe the biggest challenge we have, in part because we're serving customers, community, policymakers who've been raised and socialized in an open source world. Our policymakers are much smarter, better informed, more up to date, just from their phones than anyone could have imagined 20 years ago. So those are some thoughts about it that I think are leading to uncharted territory for the intelligence community in the future.
Just one jump on reinforcing, totally agree with John's point on open source. Do have us back for that podcast. I think it's super important. The one thing I wish I had said, and Avril Haines and any predecessor are going to blanch at this notion. These are real issues that need to be addressed. The structure of the intelligence community might need to be addressed just as the world has changed. Dan Coates and I decided not to take on structural issues because it would have consumed every piece of breath we had. And there just wasn't enough time. So to John's point about the big issues, to my point about leadership being something you need to ascribe to it, not just coordination, I have periodically thought that you needed a longer tenure for the DNI to give someone the runway they needed to do it, because 2 years to 4 years, there are too many factions that you'd have to fight. So I'll just add in that loose thought that in order to address these big changes with enough duration to overcome just the inertia of our institutions is something that might need to be addressed if that's something you expect the DNI to take on.
Well, Sue, thank you. It looks like you got the last word, at least for this discussion of the subject. And I love the idea of possibly the two of you coming back and discussing, especially the structure of the intelligence community would be a fascinating topic to go into. But Mr. John McLaughlin, Ms. Sue Gordon, on behalf of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I would like to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today and to share your insights and experiences with our listeners. Speaking of our audience, as always, we want to thank our Overheard podcast audience for listening. If you enjoy these podcasts, please visit the Foreign Policy Research Institute website at fpri.org to subscribe to our mailing list and to learn of future podcasts. Please also consider becoming a member of FPRI and donating to it to support our efforts to provide the public and policymakers with fact-driven, nonpartisan analysis about the most pressing foreign policy and national security issues facing the United States. Goodbye till next time.